This video has been published to give an introduction to the metrics used in Year 4 of the Teaching Excellence and Student Outcomes Framework. It's designed primarily for those who may be new to the TEF and new to the metrics that we use, and it's intended to support the fuller TEF Year 4 procedural guidance, which can be found on the OFS website. This video on the TEF Year 4 metrics is part of a wider series of videos we've produced to support providers and students in TEF Year 4. If this is the first video you're watching, please just be aware that there are some introductory videos you may wish to watch first. This video is going to give an introduction to what the TEF metrics are and how they're constructed, and give you a basic idea about how we present the metrics in the TEF Metrics workbooks. There is a lot more detail about how we benchmark and flag metrics and how they're used in the assessment process in some of the other videos. We published TEF Year 4 procedural guidance on the 22nd of October 2018. It updates, supplements and should be read alongside the TEF specification, which was published by the DFE in October 2017. The videos then are designed to highlight key information from the guidance in an easy to access format, but they don't themselves provide definitive guidance. For definitive guidance, please see these two documents. There's a further list of key information sources at the end of this video. Metrics play a key role in informing TEF assessments. The metrics give panel members and assessors a common set of measures that can be calculated for all providers and relate to each of the aspects of teaching excellence. There are 6 core metrics, and this is where I'm going to start, as these are the most central to the assessment process. But alongside these, there are 3 supplementary metrics, which I'll talk about later on. A few key points about all of the TEF metrics. They're drawn from existing data. They rely on data returns that providers have already submitted and signed off. The metrics only cover undergraduate provision. They don't pull in any data about postgraduate students. Metrics are calculated and presented separately for full-time and part-time students. And they're also calculated for a series of subgroups called splits, which show the performance for specific student groups. For all core metrics, the split metrics and the LEO supplementary metrics, a couple of things apply. Firstly, the metrics are made up of the most recent 3 years of aggregated data. We don't apply different weightings to each year. All 3 years, or however many are available for each provider, are taken together as a snapshot of performance. Secondly, the metrics are all benchmarked. We compare the actual performance to a measure of expected benchmark performance. And there's a separate video on the details of benchmarking. So here are the 6 core metrics and the 3 supplementary metrics that we use. I'm going to come back to these in more detail and explain how they're calculated, but I'll take a minute to give a quick summary here. Looking at the core metrics first, the first 3 core metrics pull on student responses to the National Student Survey, the NSS. The NSS is an annual survey sent to students in the final year of their course that asks students about different aspects of their studies. Each of these 3 core metrics look at the answers to a slightly different set of questions. There's one metric based on responses to questions around teaching on my course, one about assessment and feedback, and one about academic support. The next metric on continuation measures what proportion of students continue their studies from year to year. The last 2 core metrics take responses from a different survey, the Destinations of Leavers from Higher Education survey, the DHLE. The DHLE asks graduates about their employment or further study 6 months after graduation. Those are the core metrics. Looking now at the supplementary metrics, there are 2 additional measures of employment outcomes for graduates, but rather than a survey, this draws on data from the Longitudinal Education Outcomes dataset, the LEO dataset, which links higher education and tax data together to chart the transition of graduates from higher education into the workplace. Finally, there is supplementary grade inflation data, which looks at the degrees awarded by a provider and how the number of firsts and 2-1s it has awarded over the last 3 years has changed compared to what it awarded 10 years ago. That's a summary. I will go into more detail about all of these later, but the important distinction to make here is between how the core metrics and the supplementary metrics are used in the assessment process. Firstly, the 6 core metrics are used by assessors in step 1 of the assessment to form an initial hypothesis. Then, the 3 supplementary metrics are used alongside the provider submission in step 2. And as I said, all of these metrics, apart from the grade inflation data, are also reported as split metrics that show the performance of specific subgroups of students for that metric. Before I go into the detail of exactly how these metrics are calculated, there are a couple of overarching definitions that it's helpful to be familiar with in terms of how we count students and how we determine whether you have enough data to apply for a TEF award. There are a few circumstances in which a metric won't be reportable, and I'm going to go through these thresholds now. Firstly, core and split metrics must refer to at least 10 students to be reportable. Where core metrics are drawn from survey response data, the response rates need to be high enough for that data to be considered representative of a provider's student body. So where data is drawn from the NSS survey, a response rate of at least 50% is needed for the metrics to be reportable. Where data is drawn from the DHLE survey, the minimum response rate is 85% of the target rate. That's equivalent to a 68% response rate for full-time students and a 59.5% response rate for part-time students. We need to be able to benchmark a metric for it to be reportable, and that relies on having enough data about the characteristics of different students, things like age, gender, disability, and so on. In order to have sufficient data for benchmarks, we say there should be at least 50% coverage of each of the factors. So for each characteristic, we have to know how to categorize the majority of a provider's students. One more thing is that for data protection reasons, we need to ensure individual student outcomes are not identifiable through the metrics. So if out of all of your students, the positive or negative responses for a metric amount to 2 or fewer students, there's a risk that those individuals could be identified. So we apply a data protection suppression to the data in those cases. We also apply this to the split metrics, and there are cases where if we have to suppress one side of a split, we also have to suppress the other side of a split. So if we've suppressed female students because of the small numbers, we may have to suppress the male students as well. So this is just an overview. There are full details of the thresholds in the TEF Year 4 guidance that you can find on our website. But there's also here a key that shows how these different suppressions will be presented in the TEF metric workbooks. To be able to apply for a TEF assessment, a provider must have suitable metrics in its majority mode of study. So majority mode is whether most of a provider's students are studying full-time or part-time. There is a third category for mode of study that we calculate, which is part-time other undergraduate. And we look at this first because if a provider's majority mode of study is part-time other undergraduate, there is a slightly different rule for determining suitable metrics. But if the provider doesn't have a majority mode of part-time other undergraduate, then we just do a straight calculation between full-time or part-time, inclusive of all part-time students, and determine the majority mode based on that. The majority mode is calculated on the basis of student headcounts. It's averaged over the same period as the number of years used for a provider's contextual data, but typically it's averaged over the last 3 years. Note that if the provider has at least 35% of students studying in part-time, regardless of whether that's the majority mode, then we flag that up because it has a slight impact on the process by which we assess them. Providers with 35% or more students in part-time are eligible to submit an additional page of data to mitigate some of the difficulties of drawing together data for part-time students. Having identified the majority mode, we then need to know if a provider has suitable metrics in that mode. To have suitable metrics, each of the provider's core metrics must be reportable, either when they're aggregated together over 3 years or for at least one individual year. The number of years of suitable metrics is first calculated for each of the 6 core metrics individually. Where a core metric is reportable in aggregate, the number of years that it's suitable for is the number of years in which there are students contributing to that data. The provider's overall number of years of suitable metrics is the lowest number of years of data informing any one of the 6 core metrics. So for example, if as a provider you have 3 years of continuation metrics, 2 years of NSS-based metrics and 1 year of DHLE metrics, as a provider you have 1 year of suitable metrics. And it's only the core metrics that contribute to this calculation. A provider can apply for assessment in TEF Year 4 if it has at least 1 year of reportable metrics. If not, the provider will not be eligible for assessment in TEF Year 4, but it can opt to receive a provisional rating. Both the number of years of suitable metrics and the majority mode are identified in a provider's workbook. You don't have to work this out yourself. We show it on the front page of the metrics workbook in the form shown below. Here is the core metrics page of the TEF Metrics workbook for a fictional provider. And in this case, you can see that 62% of students are full-time and 38% are part-time. The majority mode is therefore full-time, although the part-time provision accounts for more than 35%, so this provider would be able to submit an extra page in its submission to add some of the detail about their part-time provision. Now I'm going to go into a bit more of the detail about the core and split metrics and how they're calculated. So here again is the core metrics page of that fictional provider's TEF Metrics workbook. Highlighted on the left are the 6 core metrics, and you can see they're reported separately for full-time at the top and part-time at the bottom. The core metrics are split up between 3 aspects of quality. So the first 2 metrics drawn from the NSS, teaching on my course and assessment and feedback, relate to the teaching quality aspect. The next 2, the academic support metric from the NSS and the continuation metric, relate to the learning environment aspect of quality. And the last 2, employment and further study and highly skilled employment or further study from the DHLE survey, relate to the student outcomes and learning gain aspect of quality. Highlighted here is the indicator that this provider achieves for each of its metrics for full-time students, and I'm going to go into a bit more detail now about how these indicators are calculated. So as we've already discussed, the first 3 core metrics are drawn from the NSS data. Core metrics aggregate data from the most recent 3 years as far as that's available for a provider. So that means in TEF Year 4, the NSS metrics draw on responses to the NSS surveys in 2018, 2017 and 2016. The NSS is open to international students as well, so whereas the other core metrics just look at UK domiciled students, the NSS-based metrics include any international students who respond to the survey. Each NSS metric draws on a group of questions from the NSS or a question scale. So the teaching on my course metric is informed by the teaching on my course question scale. That's made up of questions 1 to 4 in the NSS. So for calculating the teaching on my course indicator, or indeed any of the other NSS metric indicators, we look first at the extent to which each student agrees with each question in the scale, and then average this across the number of students who have responded to at least one of the questions in the scale, ignoring any not applicable responses. And let me show you how that works in practice. So here's a worked example of calculating the NSS indicator. We've used a very simplified example with a very small sample of 5 students A to E, just for ease of illustration. In this example, student A has agreed to 3 of the questions and neither agreed nor disagreed to the 4th. So in this case, the student is calculated as being in agreement or having a satisfaction level of 75% in relation to the teaching on my course question scale. Student B, on the other hand, has the same pattern of responses for question 1 to 3, but ticked not applicable for question 4. So they are calculated as being 100% satisfied because every question they identified as being applicable to them was answered positively. So we repeat that for every student and then we take an average. So the total percentage agree is 350. There were 5 students. That gives a teaching on my course indicator of 70%. We repeat this for each of the NSS scales and each of the splits to come up with the NSS metric indicators. The next core metric is continuation. We calculate it slightly differently for full-time and part-time students, so we'll look at full-time continuation first. For TEF Year 4, the 3 aggregated years we use draw on students who started their studies in the academic years set out in the table. The denominator, or the total number of students who factor into the calculation of the metric, is all UK domiciled entrants in those years. The numerator, or the students who count as a positive response for the metric, are any of those students who in the next year are either active in higher education or have gained a higher education qualification at any provider we have data for. So they don't have to be studying at the same provider or in the same course to be counted positively, they just have to be studying in higher education somewhere. And if students are no longer studying but have left having gained a qualification, we pick those up as positive responses too. The continuation rate then is a lot easier to calculate than the NSS example we just looked at. It's just the numerator divided by the denominator expressed as a percentage. So for part-time, the calculation is slightly different. We look at the data for entrants a year earlier than for full-time, so students starting their studies in the years given in the table. And also, we don't look at all UK domiciled students in this year, just those starting first degree courses. We then look for those students in the next 2 years of data, and they can be counted positively against the metric if either in the next year they're active at a different higher education provider or have gained a qualification from any provider, or in the next but 1 year they are active anywhere, including the same provider, or have gained a higher education qualification. Again, the continuation rate is just the numerator divided by the denominator expressed as a percentage. So for the 2 DHLE metrics, and this is the same for full-time or part-time students, again it looks at UK domiciled students based on who qualified in the academic years given here. There are 2 metrics. The first is more simple, the employment or further study metric. The denominator for this metric includes students who qualified in these years that have replied to the DHLE survey with information about their destination 6 months after leaving higher education. The denominator only includes students that say they were working, studying, unemployed or due to start work. Those that have responded saying they were doing something else, typically taking time out to travel, retired or with caring responsibilities, are not included in the calculation. All the other categories of the response are included in the denominator. The numerator then is just those who said they were working or studying. Again, the metric is expressed as a percentage. The calculation of the highly skilled employment or further study metric is very similar. The denominator is the same. The numerator, the successful outcomes, still includes any students that said their main activity was studying, but for those who said their main activity was working, it only includes those who are in highly skilled employment. This is worked out by matching the job title and duties that students put down in the survey to the standard occupational classification the government uses to define highly skilled jobs. As used elsewhere in student information, we are interpreting highly skilled jobs to be those that are professional and managerial according to the standard occupational classification, the SOC. This means SOC major groups 1 to 3 count as highly skilled. So that is how we calculate each of the metric indicators. But in total, there are 6 different elements of the core metrics data, and these are highlighted in the workbook here. We've discussed a couple of these already. The denominators for each metric give the total number of students contributing to the calculation. We've covered the next column, the indicators, which are the percentage of those students that are counted positively. The denominator and the indicator tell us about a provider's actual performance. The next few columns are here to help panel members and assessors meaningfully interpret that performance. I'll go into some of these subsequent columns in more detail in a different video, but I'll just give a quick summary here. Column by column, firstly, the benchmark is a measure of expected performance. We calculate it to allow fair comparison between providers by controlling for factors which may affect the metrics but that are outside of a provider's control. We have benchmarks for each of the core metrics and for each split of that metric. Difference is the difference between a provider's indicator and its benchmark for each metric. The Z-scores are measures we use to help determine whether that difference is statistically significant or not. And then the last column, the significance flag, act as a summary of that information, highlighting where the provider's indicator is materially different and statistically significantly different from the benchmark. Again, we have another video in the series on benchmarking and significance flags that will go into all of this in a lot more detail. I've made a few references to the split metrics already, and this is how the split metrics appear in the TEF Metrics workbook. So as well as providing you the overall data for each metric, the workbooks show the same information for a number of subgroups of students called splits. This is the headline sheet that summarises the significance flags for each core metric and each of the split metric groups. By presenting data across various sections of the student body, we hope to be able to give panel members and assessors a sense of whether a provider serves that particular part of the student body better or worse than other providers serve the same part of its student body. So beyond just looking at providers' performance as a whole, it's possible to look specifically at the outcomes for a provider's disadvantaged students or at their mature students or perhaps their female students and compare whether the outcomes for those types of students are better, worse or broadly the same as similar students at other providers. So to reiterate, we're not benchmarking these subgroups against the rest of the student population at the institution nor against students with the opposing characteristics, but against the same group of students at all other providers across the sector. Because that table was a bit small, I've listed out here all the split metric categories that we use. The split metrics for TEF Year 4 are identical to the ones that we used in TEF Year 3, apart from a couple of differences in the split metrics for the LEO supplementary metrics. Full details of the split metrics are given in the Year 4 procedural guidance, including the categories that sit underneath each split. There is a lot more detail within the workbooks than we've seen so far. So I just showed you the page of the workbook that gave the different significance flags for each of the core and split metrics. But there's a wealth of other information within the workbooks for both core and split metrics. And the following are some of the detailed tabs that you can find. Firstly, there's an indicators tab which shows for each core and split metric the numeric value of the metric. Similarly, a benchmarking flag that shows the numeric value of the benchmark for core and split metrics and also shows the extent to which a provider contributes to the calculation of its own benchmark. Differences and Z-scores is something we'll go into later, but there's a tab for each that gives the differences and Z-scores for core and split metrics. The populations tab shows the numerators and denominators for core and split metrics, and then the BME breakdown tab breaks down outcomes by ethnicity in a more detailed way than just white or BME. The first 5 of these lists are very similar and should give you a very detailed sense of what is going on at a provider. There is one more thing to discuss in relation to core metric indicators, which is very high or very low absolute values. Very high absolute values are flagged with an asterisk, and very low absolute values are flagged with an exclamation mark. This is how they appear in the workbook. And in our fictional example, this provider has 3 asterisks. So this is showing us, for example, on the Teaching on My Course metric, that the provider's indicator of 90.2% is very high and among the top satisfaction rates for this metric in the entire sector. These markers are only applied to the indicator. They're unbenchmarked, so they don't take into account the provider's mix of students or subjects. They only apply to the core metric indicator and the supplementary LEO metric indicators. We don't calculate or identify high and low absolute values for any of the split metric categories. To define these in a bit more detail then, an asterisk for a high absolute value means that a provider's indicator is in the top 10% for that metric across the sector. The exclamation mark means that the indicator is in the bottom 10%. When we're calculating the thresholds that constitute the top and bottom 10% of the sector, we only include large providers, defined as providers with at least 100 students in the denominator. That's just to avoid the calculations being distorted by volatility of providers with very small numbers. But once we've calculated those thresholds, they're applied in the same way to all providers, big or small. In the assessment process, very high and low absolute value markers are considered at step 1b. So this is after the formulaic calculation of the provider's starting point, which is based on the core metric flags. High or low absolute value markers can be counted as similar to a positive core metric flag in certain circumstances. We've now calculated the thresholds for high and low absolute values for TEF Year 4, and these are set out in the values given in this table. As with the metrics, the thresholds are calculated separately for full-time and part-time students. So, for example, looking at the continuation metric for full-time students, if you have a metric indicator that's higher than 95.83%, you will receive an asterisk. And if you have an indicator that's below 79.04, you'd get an exclamation mark. This video is intended as an introduction to the TEF metrics, but full and definitive information about the assessment process and how we use data is included in the guidance documents for TEF Year 4 that are published on the OFS website. Any provider thinking about applying to TEF Year 4 should read the guidance in full. Web links and contact information for the Office for Students are given on the screen. For inquiries about TEF policy, please contact the Department for Education in England. You may reuse the content of this video under the terms of the Open Government Licence. If you adapt the slides, you should be aware that the content cannot be used in a way that suggests the OFS endorses you or the use of the information. Thank you for listening.